I'm talking today to Dr. Tony Press, who has just completed and the government has released today a report into the 20-year strategic outlook for Australia in terms of its Antarctic policy settings. Tony, thanks for taking the time to talk to ASPI today.
Thank you.
Can you tell me what are some of the key recommendations that your report makes?
Well, I'm asking the government to be very clear about what its Antarctic interests are. I've made recommendations about formulating those interests in the public domain and also within government assigning to appropriate departments responsibility for ensuring that Australia's strategic Antarctic interests are looked after and reported to government. On from there, I'm saying that our aspirations in Antarctica should be matched by the effort that we put into science, logistics, political engagement, diplomacy, and our entire suite of Antarctic efforts.
It's clearly an issue that has some fairly big dollars attached to it, Tony, and I know the government quite recently made an announcement about acquiring a new icebreaker. Can you talk a little bit about that decision for a start, but also say what you think the kind of costs of Australia's sustaining Australia's presence in Antarctica involve?
Well, the recent decision by the government to proceed with the tender process for the replacement of Australia's Aurora Australis is a very significant decision indeed, and a very important one, because the icebreaker, its ability to resupply the stations in Antarctica and Australia's efforts in Antarctica is critical. So is its ability to operate as a scientific platform. But even more important than that, it's also its ability to engage with others in Antarctica and bring partners into the Antarctic program. So this investment, a more capable vessel than the current Aurora Australis, is very, very important for our Antarctic future. There are other things that are also important, and some of those aren't immediate decisions. They're decisions to be thought about now and planned for the future. But making the most from our investment in the replacement for Aurora Australis, we need to look at the future structure of our air transport system. Australia was very innovative in flying a wheeled jet to Antarctica in the early 2000s and basing a air transport system around that capability. There are now aircraft available that weren't available then, and we should be looking at the future options for intra and intercontinental air transport to Antarctica to get the maximum advantage of the new vessel and our ability to do research in the Antarctic. That's also would be a very good platform for international collaboration with other countries in East Antarctica and the Australian Antarctic Territory. And we also need to look at the structure of our program, what are the important things that we do there and where we do them. We have been historically confined to the coast of Antarctica because of our logistic capabilities or logistic incapabilities.
Yes.
And the ability to be able to go to anywhere in the Australian Antarctic Territory or Antarctica as a whole is going to be really important in the future as the big questions about Antarctica and their importance to Australia grow.
Yes. Now, I'll come back to the transport in a second because I think that's where defence potentially can play into the issue. But can you say a little bit about the sort of science agenda? Because obviously that's the purpose for why it's imperative for Australia to be able to get to Antarctica and to maintain a presence there. How do you see that sort of shaping out over the next couple of decades?
Well, in my report I've outlined why science is central to the Antarctic Treaty System. The Antarctic Treaty itself is based on peace, collaboration, cooperation and science in Antarctica. So science is the currency of influence in the Antarctic Treaty System. But it's more important than just that. I mean, there are big questions in Antarctica that tell us about Australia and that have economic implications for Australia. For instance, we've been able to show the links between weather patterns in Antarctica and drought and rainfall in both Western Australia and Eastern Australia. So those parts of Australia that are economically important for agriculture, we can learn a lot about the past and the future from the research we do in Antarctica. Antarctic science is also expensive and logistically difficult to undertake. So one of the other important things about future science in Antarctica is that it will require much more international collaboration, not only in terms of scientists involved, but in terms of the logistics that are required to undertake that science, both in the ocean and on the continent itself.
Do you think the sense of collaboration is in some ways at threat? Because we've certainly written in the Antarctic series we did on the strategist site about an increasing sense of interest on the part of a number of major countries to do science in Antarctica. But I just wonder if the sort of picture of competition rather than collaboration seems to be becoming more of a feature these days.
I think there's an element of that, particularly as new countries emerge with investments in Antarctic programs. They naturally want to be able to show their governments what they are doing. But the fact of the matter is that the future will actually be about collaboration, not about individual effort, because the big questions about the stability of the Antarctic ice sheet, the big questions about what's happening in the Southern Ocean and how it's changing and what the implications for Antarctic fisheries might be, all of those require international collaboration to solve those big questions.
Now, who would you see being the principal potential partners for Australia in that collaborative approach?
Well, out of the new and emerging countries, I think China is very much front and centre of Australia's future collaborative efforts. India as well, Korea possibly, and then our traditional long-term partners in Antarctica like Japan, the United States, New Zealand, France, and then we also have many collaborations with European countries, Germany, for instance.
And where would you say Australia sits in, if this is the right term, the international pecking order of Antarctic science?
Well, the last objective study of scientific output actually put Australia around about third or fourth. Mm-hmm. When you consider the investment by the United States, which dwarfs any other country in terms of science investment in the Antarctic, the United Kingdom, of course, and the European investment, Australia coming out there is quite significant, considering that our program is very, very lean and mean in that sense. Australia's overall investments in our Antarctic efforts, in the middle 150, 165 million, that sort of ballpark figure, and that's very small compared to other big countries in the Antarctic.
Well, now let me go back to an angle that, of course, we have a particular interest in here at ASPI, which is Defence's potential role in this. What did your report have to say about whether or not Defence should or could potentially play a part in any part of Australia's Antarctic policy?
Okay, so if you read through my report, you'll see that I've not stated that Defence should or shouldn't do this, but what I've said is that there's an opportunity there for Australia. Let's look at air logistics, for instance. There's an opportunity for Australia to make whole of government decisions about capabilities in the future, whether they be air capabilities, shipping capabilities. And in that context, there's two sides of the coin. Defence may be able to help Australia in its Antarctic program, for instance, by flying heavy lift aircraft to the Wilkins runway or other runways in the future in Antarctica to carry big scientific equipment, say for deep field exercises like drilling a million-year-old ice core. On the other side of that, assets like the replacement for Aurora Australis should also be available when they're not prioritised for Antarctic research or Antarctic logistics. They may be utilised elsewhere in the Southern Ocean or elsewhere in Australia's interest. So what I've said in my report is that the future logistics frameworks, the future priorities and models for supplying and resupplying Antarctica and taking people to and from Antarctica should be made on a whole of government basis, so that the efficiencies or the synergies between various parts of the government can be best utilised.
Well, Tony, it does seem that the government has some renewed interest in Antarctic matters. It had the good sense to appoint you to undertake the study. It's made the announcement about tendering for the ice-breaking capability. But now you're at that point where you've completed your study, it's had our blessing and it's been publicly released. What's your aspirations for what you would like government to do with your work? And what is the challenges that really government needs to face up to now?
Well, I suppose the first aspiration is to take the recommendations seriously and look hard at them. Yes. I've spent a long time in the Antarctic business, and I've thought about this issue very deeply. And the Antarctic Treaty, that region south of 60 degrees south, adjacent to Australia's southern borders, is a zone of peace and cooperation. We don't have to worry about militarising that part of the world or having to defend in a military sense that part of the world. So we need, I think, to preserve the status quo and the integrity of the Antarctic Treaty System. And that's a really important recommendation over and above the practical things we do there. So I would want the government to put my recommendations in that strategic context. What do we need to do as a country to maintain the stability, the peace and harmony of that region? And then how do we influence future developments? And what do we need to do to influence the way the Antarctic Treaty System develops into the future?
Well, I have to say, Tony, I envy you because you've completed your report for government, and I'll be very happy to be in a position to say that the same thing when the Defence White Paper is done, probably about mid-2015. We'll certainly be drawing on your report to inform what we say about Antarctica in that document. And in the meantime, I want to sort of thank you for your service in producing this piece of work. And thanks for coming to talk to ASPI to tell us what it contains.
Thank you very much.